Hello.
Hi
Oh, yep.
there.
Hang on, I'm getting it all fixed. There we go. Eric and I are here. I'm gonna have to
Yep.
mute it because the kids are in the kitchen doing the dishes, so I don't know if you can hear that, but
No, I cannot.
oh, then I guess I can leave it.
Where's the chat?
Oh, hang on. That's right.
Now it's better. I'm sorry. Took my microphone off.
Hey, Pastor, can you remind me what episode we're doing today?
We are doing season 3, episode 2, which I believe is called 2 by 2. I believe what the episode's name is. Double check this.
You said season 2, episode 2?
Season 3, episode 2.
Oh, thank you. Oops.
And yes, it is called 2 by 2. And Josh was just asking if
Oh.
all of the disciples actually have their own book in the Bible, that they are writings in the Bible, which I couldn't answer.
The answer is no, not all of them. We have Peter, we have John, we have Matthew. Trying to think of other ones. I think that's it actually that are actually disciples. The rest, well, Jude. Jude would be the other one. Well, that one we're uncertain about. Specifically who wrote it. There are 2 Judes or Judases mentioned that could be the author of Jude, but we aren't given anything more other than Jude. I think Jude would be the only one that'd be questionable, but we got John, Peter, and Matthew. They're the only 3 who wrote anything for the New Testament. That doesn't mean that the others didn't write anything. They just are the 3 that we still have something for that is a trustworthy and reliable and authenticated writing.
Hey, you know that thing you asked me for yesterday? I transferred the money now. Then
I think you're not muted.
No, it's you that's not muted,
me.
Renee.
it's you.
I really need to mute.
All right, but
He was talking to the teenagers. Sorry about that.
That's fine. I assumed he was because it sounded further away.
Right?
Yeah.
Getting back to this episode though, this is one of my favorites. I always have a tissue whenever I'm watching The Chosen, but this one especially was really good.
Yes. Yes. This one I really liked, and we're going to talk a little bit about things that are a bit teary-eyed towards the end of this lesson when we get to it. Just have to do a little bit of reminding myself of what happened in this episode.
Pastor, can you put a link to the questions in the chat?
I will in a little bit.
Okay.
We discovered that if I send it now, the 3 people who are on will receive it, but anyone who might join in a little bit, they won't have access to it.
Okay.
So what we do is I do my little summary, which I'm about to start here. And then after I'm done with that and we're done talking about it, I will send the link and everyone will have access to it then. Anyone who comes later will deal with that at that point. But this at least gives people a little more chance to show up at this point. All right, so welcome back everybody to this Bible class series on The Chosen. Glad to be back, glad to be able to talk about this again because in February, season 4 is being released in theaters. So I'm very excited about that. We still have a long ways to go before we get to season 4, but that's okay because that means season 4 will be probably fully released by the time we actually are getting into season 4, so we can talk about it then. And it'll be fresh in a lot of our minds, more fresh than probably all of these ones are. But today we are going to be talking about season 3, episode 2, which is called 2 by 2. And a brief summary of this episode would be that all the disciples basically go home, more or less. They go to the home that is in Galilee there, where Peter and Andrew live, where James and John live, and where Matthew also lives. And also Mary, she also has a home there. And they all go to their separate homes, and they are told by Jesus eventually he's going to call them all back together, but that for now they are going to be staying here, which is very exciting for Peter because he's missed his wife a lot and he looks forward to being able to spend time with her, just the 2 of them, but he also is now expected to house some of the disciples whose home is not there. So he's housing them and all that sort of thing. And everyone is sort of helping each other out, and everyone is reconciling, figuring things out for each other. And then eventually, Jesus does come back and gathers them all together. And he tells them that he is now going to be taking a little break. He is going to actually be going home for a while, and that he's sending his disciples out in groups of 2. And the disciples are all shocked by this. They don't know that they're ready, but he says, you are ready. You could just teach everything that I have been teaching. And then he tells them, you're going to perform miracles and drive out demons, which shocks them even more. But they go out and decide, or they listen to Jesus and accept what is going to happen here. And so now the disciples have to deal with the fact that they are going to be leaving. Simon at this point still has to deal with the fact that he is now suddenly leaving his wife again, quite unexpectedly, going as far away from her as possible. is really where he is going. He's going all the way to the southern part of Israel. So he's going to be very far away from her. And all the disciples are sort of dealing with their own things, trying to figure things out. And we see that in a conversation between little James and Jesus. Trying to think of what other things. Well, finally, we do see the disciples come together in order to get ready to leave. And Simon Peter talks with Simon the Zealot about the fact that he's going to be traveling with Matthew, and we see him really talking up Simon the Zealot in how he speaks to him, saying that Jesus must see something in him, that he is going to be able to deal with the fact that Matthew is a former tax collector, and that Simon the Zealot must be the best of them if Jesus thinks he can deal with that fact, despite them being opposites of each other. And then they say a Hebrew prayer before they go their separate ways and leave. Is there anything that I missed that people want me to have mentioned, talked about a little bit? Some of it I didn't go too deep into because we're going to talk a little bit more about it in our discussion today.
Pastor, did you mention about little James' interaction with Jesus?
Yes, I mentioned that. I didn't go into too much detail about it because we're going to
Okay.
save a deeper discussion for that at the end. 'Cause I think it's a very good discussion to have about that. Anything else? Not, then I'm going to send out the link for the Bible class and let everyone jump on to that now. I think that everyone is here who is going to be here, so now everyone has access to the Bible class. All right, that should have given everyone enough time. Our first thing that we're going to talk about is actually about Simon and his wife. Seeing the two of them interacting, I figured now would be a good time to talk about marriage. Yes, talk about marriage with a bunch of people who are married and had been married longer than me, but it is still a good thing to talk about, and especially in view of what we see happening in the episode, what we see happening throughout that episode, and it's really going to play a big part in this season. Their marriage is going to play a big role in Simon's life. So we're going to read from Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 all the way to verse 33. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church, and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you also must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. All right, so the first thing we should talk about is just before this. Usually, if you're looking at your English Bibles, you'll notice that there is a break between verse 21 and verse 22. Usually in your NIVs, they put a title right there where Paul switches to talking about marriage. However, in Greek, there weren't any of those. It was all one big letter with no breaks whatsoever. And so verse 21 and verse 22 follow right after each other. So what does Paul say to all people before he starts talking about marriage?
I'm pulling it up. Sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
Are you talking about the part where it says instruction for Christian households?
Well, if you're looking at that, I'm talking about verse right before that. Because that part that says instructions for households, that is not original.
Right.
So I'm talking about the fact that these two things aren't actually supposed to be separated in that way. We shouldn't separate them in our minds, and we're going to talk about why. But what does Paul say before he starts talking about those instructions for households?
The verse before
Submit-
that, always give thanks to God the Father for everything in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ.
In verse 21,
In verse 20.
in verse 21 though, that's what I'm talking about. It usually
sorry.
splits 21 and
Okay.
22.
I'm using the app. So in the app, it gives instructions for Christian households, and then it says verse 21.
Okay,
submit
so
to
that's
one another
different.
out of
Because
reverence to Christ.
sometimes English translations shift that one up
Yeah,
because
gotcha.
it's not talking directly about households. But yeah, no,
Mine is separated. Mine has 21 with 20, and then it has the wives and husbands
Yep.
starting with 22.
yep. Maybe in the new NIV they've switched it. I'm not sure which translation you're using, Renee. When
I
you
have
I'm
the
just using
original.
the NIV app, so it's probably the new one.
Yeah, it's most likely if you're using that. Yeah, it's most likely the 2011 version, which I think does do that because people have recognized those two things are more connected than with the previous section, but it really does all flow in one coherent thought as you read through them. But yeah, he tells all people they are to submit to one another. Now, with that in mind, how are we to understand what Paul says to wives?
Well, the way I look at it is they both give a little something, like she respects him and he's supposed to love her and
Yep.
die for her. So, I
Yep,
mean, they're both
definitely.
giving. It's just that it always seems like the church only focuses on what the wives are supposed to do.
Yep.
So,
And for the purposes of this, let's pretend we don't know what he has said to husbands yet. We only see what he says to wives. Taking into account what he says in verse 21, what are we to understand about what he is saying to wives here?
Submit to your husbands like you would to Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, he is just basically saying, hey, you know that thing you're doing with everybody? Well, now I'm going to talk specifically about your husband, and you should do that also specifically for your husband.
Todd said they left off the part that it's conditional, though. If it's not reciprocated, then you don't have to do it.
Yeah,
He's joking, Pastor. He was
I
just
know.
joking.
I know. Yeah, but it is simply submit yourself in the same way that you're submitting to everyone else, how you're supposed to be a servant to the world. Also be willing to do that with your husband as well. And we'll get to talking about what that means with what husbands then are supposed to do. But now let's talk about this. How does what Paul says to wives in verse 23 and 24 match with verse 21?
I guess you're talking about the wife submits to the husband and the husband submits to Christ. Like,
Yeah,
So
this is this is basically what we've been talking about with that previous question. It's just really focusing in on it because we see now he is breaking it down, showing exactly how it's going to be the same. That wives should submit to their husbands in the same way that the church submits to Christ. That these two things are now equivalent to each other.
It doesn't leave any doubt for misinterpretation.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Those who want to say, look, the Bible is saying that wives are to be submissive, they're to be just basically servants to their husbands, that they are not equal to each other. That's not at all what we see being talked about here at all. It is a willing submission, a person who wants to show love, because that's what we're supposed to do for Christ, show our love for him.
well, and I
Uh,
think what happened, the reason why this got so misunderstood is because people cherry pick. And so they find the one little part of the Bible that they don't like, and then they use that as justification not to read anything else. And then they twist it, because we are supposed to be putting ourselves last. I mean, that's what it says, submit to one another. You're supposed to put
Yeah.
other people before yourself. And this is no different, but our world doesn't say that. Our world says, do for yourself first.
Yep. Yeah, they often just take verse 22 there and say, oh, that's it. Look at that. They just want submissive wives. That's all they want. But then we look at what Paul says about husbands. Now we're going to just look at verse 25, looking just at verse 25. What does Paul say about husbands? And does that seem comparable with what is asked of wives?
Comparable is that to what's asked of wives?
No,
I think it actually
it's actually
seems
more.
like way worse. I
Yeah.
mean, not worse, but
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So you're thinking of the passion, you're thinking of Christ hanging on the cross. That's way more intense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a lot more intense than what he says to wives. It says, wives, submit yourself to your husband just as the church submits to Christ. Husbands, die for your wives. That's basically what he's saying.
In a way, yeah, it's more, but then it's also double because men are supposed to submit. Now, this might sound weird, so bear with me, but we are also supposed to submit to our wives because in the previous verse, everyone is supposed to submit to everybody. So we are supposed to submit to our wives and also die for our wives.
Yep.
Whereas wives are not asked to die for their husbands.
Yep.
I think it's a really interesting bit of psychology if you think about it, that in terms of how to speak the language of each gender, men are usually a more physically oriented way of thinking about things, and to say that give up your life, it is something we understand. We can comprehend that level of sacrifice. And the other one is one of service. That's a little bit more difficult, but women seem to understand that level better than most men.
Mhm.
So I find it really interesting bit of psychology here in that passage.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's also, like, if we look at how Jesus speaks, and since husbands are supposed to be like Christ, we can see in what Christ says all of these things. And we even see that servant side, because Christ says, I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. So right away, right in that, we see that. And then on top of that, he uses the word love, which Jesus says, no greater love than this, than a man lay down his life for his friend. This is the greatest form of love, is to lay down one's life. So in that way, Paul is really just pointing back to everything that Christ said himself. But now, other than comparing the husband to Christ, what else does Paul compare the relationship between a husband and a wife?
Right.
Do you mean going back to the church comparison? Is that what you mean?
Nope. So that was the first part. He starts by saying, okay, so wives are the church. Well, husbands, that means you have to be like Christ. And then he talks about that a little bit, and then he switches his picture. He says, now husbands, you are to love your wives as this.
As their own body.
Your
Yes.
body? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You are to love your wives as your own body, because anyone who loves his wife loves himself. And then points out that no one ever hates their body. They feed for it and care for it, just as Christ does the church. So he does bring it back to Christ in the church, but he starts by saying, look, just like you take care of your own body, well, that's the same thing you should be doing with your wife. And then, after this comparison, this is where we get the familiar Genesis verse about marriage, where he says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So how does Paul's quote from Genesis defend his comparison of bodies and marriage? That the husband's body is comparable to the wife.
They're two halves and they make a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, that these two separate individuals have now come together and they have become one. They are one completely. And therefore, to hate one side of that relationship is really to hate yourself.
I've been teaching fractions and adding unlike denominators this week, Renee. You'll appreciate this. So 5/5 is the same as 1/2. 3/5 isn't a whole. 2/5, it doesn't even matter if it's unequal. 4/5 and 1/5, it's still not a whole with only parts.
Yep. Yep, exactly. And that is always a great picture of it, that you need two people together.
Well, and honestly, the cool thing about this is the idea we're made in God's image, right? So all the characteristics and stuff of God, he's given half of, I don't know, this is correct me if I'm wrong. His feminine attributes are given to the women and the masculine attributes are given to the men, and then the two become one. It's like you complement each other.
Yep. I would agree. That is very true. And that can get into a whole lots of other issues with people saying, well, then God is not a masculine being. He is a non-binary being because he's both male and female at the same time.
Oh, I wasn't going there with
I
that.
know, but
Don't say that.
I have heard that argument from
Right.
people trying to point that out, but that doesn't negate him seeing himself as a man and with male pronouns. That's what he tells us. Now, Paul throughout this has been comparing the relationship between God and the church to marriage. Now let's do the reverse, because that's really what his point is at the end. He says, this is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. So it sounded like he was talking about marriage, but at the end he says, no, I'm talking about the relationship between Christ and the church. So how does marriage reflect the relationship between God and the church?
Well, Christ as the husband sacrificed himself for all of us, the church, to go to heaven if
Mhm.
through our belief in him, through our faith in him. If that's what you mean.
Yeah. Yeah, this is exactly what Paul is really getting at here, that the relationship between a husband and wife, especially when he quotes Genesis, is showing that we were two separate things. We were God and we were us. But in Christ, God has now brought us together once again. We are now his forever, and nothing can separate us from God's love. So are there any questions about Ephesians 5?
Here's another little interesting thing for women who wrestled with this whole submit yourselves. Like, if I know my husband's going to die for me, you're darn right I'm going to respect him. I mean, how hard is that, you know? So, and I just think they don't focus on what the husbands are supposed to do. And so then, of course, with the feminist movement and all that, everything's just gotten turned upside down, you know?
Yep, exactly. They don't read past verse 22. They read those first two words and they're just like, nope, we can't accept this. This is trying to put women down. It's trying to support the patriarchy, keep women down. But if they keep reading, they realize, well, men have the worst end of the deal, as they are expected to die for their wives.
They go back to
But men don't do their wives any favors sometimes by not being someone who their wife can respect.
Yep.
So
That's true.
we could we could make it easier on our wives by being respectful and honorable men,
Yep.
which is impossible for us because we're not perfect, but it's certainly something we can work on.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, in those instances, we should just die.
Yep. And when we went through the sixth commandment in catechism, I wanted us to focus on this relationship between God and the church and how it is comparable with the with husbands and wives. And while I was talking through this with them, I said, in the end, basically what Paul says is that wives should submit to their husbands because their husbands love them. And husbands ought to love their wives and serve them. And this leads into this whole cycle of trying to outserve each other. It's a competition to see who can serve each other the most. That's really what Paul is saying here. Wives, you should serve your husbands because you love him just like you love Christ, and you would do anything for Christ. So you should do the same thing for your husbands. Now, husbands, Christ loves you, the church, so much that he was willing to die for you. That's how much you should love your wife and try and serve her as much as possible. Well, now you have two people who are trying to serve each other, and really it leads to this whole cycle of, well, I'm going to do it because he has shown me such love. I want to serve him. Well, now she's shown me how much she loves me by how she serves. I want to do stuff for her. And it really is this competition between the two sides to outserve each other. Yep, pride gets in the way when we are wronged, though, because we all have times when we aren't respectful or loving. Yep, that is the issue. But that perfect relationship should be a continuous battle between the two to outserve each other in a loving way, not as I can now hold something over you because I served last. Now you have to do something to outserve me. It's this, I want to because they're doing it to me. A constant cycle of serving each other.
And even when that does happen, when it doesn't happen that way, that doesn't negate what it says, which is
Nope.
it isn't conditional. I mean, Todd was joking about that at the beginning, but And that's hard too, because you have to let go of that.
Can get in a vicious cycle.
Yes, vicious
Yeah.
cycle. Todd said it can get in a vicious cycle. He's of course not speaking of our marriage though.
Yeah, yeah.
He's not laughing now.
And yeah, just like Eric is saying, you got to watch out for that scorekeeping. Yeah, it is not. In fact, it should be like, even if that person is losing, they aren't serving you in an equal sort of way. For instance, let's say that the wife does 4 things for the husband, and the husband hasn't done anything for her in a while. That doesn't mean she should stop serving to let him catch up in any way. She should continue to serve him, knowing that he still loves her and cares for her. He just may not be able to show it in a big way, and it might be, look at the small things that he's doing. Is he still paying for this house? Is he still bringing home the money in order to be able to pay for food and all that sort of thing? Is he doing other things that may be preventing him from doing some bigger things that you may be asking him to do?
Well, and I think the scorekeeping only happens when somebody starts to feel like there's an imbalance,
Yep.
you know, and like you said, you do have to acknowledge something that is very second nature for me is not something that's second nature for Eric. And so, you know,
Yep.
when he does that, that's like a huge thing to him. But to me, it might be like, oh, that's no big deal because I do that all the time. And you
Yep.
don't realize the value of the effort that's being made.
Yep, exactly. And yeah, so yeah, you can't keep score really. It's actually kind of impossible to keep a good score, because one thing that is big to someone else is small to the other person, just like you were saying. Right, are there any other questions or comments about that section? If not, we went through that because we're going to be seeing a lot of the marriage of Simon and Eden throughout this season. It's going to play a big role in this season. So we needed to talk about their marriage and what it was like at this point. It is very much a great Christian marriage. She supported him 100%, saying that this is what you ought to be doing, and supporting him in that, even though it takes him away from her for a very long time. But now let's talk about what we see actually in the episode, where Jesus is now sending the disciples out 2 by 2. We'll read this. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message: the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts. No bag for the journey, or extra shirt or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person, and stay at their house until you leave. As you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. Truly, I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. All right, so the first question is got to deal with what Jesus is sending them to do. Where does Jesus send the disciples to that may seem different than what we picture for whom the gospel is for?
They're going only to fellow Israelis right now.
Yeah,
Israelites.
yep. They're sent specifically to the Jews.
Yep, he is still trying to recover his chosen people.
Yep. And that really answers that next question of why would Jesus send them there first? Why would he send them first to the Jews and say, leave the Gentiles out of it? It's really because they are God's chosen people. They're the one that this message was specifically intended for, and for them to then spread it to the rest of the world. So they
I think
need
it would
to
be an
go-
interesting exercise if you thought about it. If he had actually sent them to the Gentiles and the Samaritans, how even less likely would the Jews have then accepted his message?
Yep. Yep, exactly. They would have had trouble accepting that. It would have been a very strange thing to them. Not that Gentiles weren't becoming Jews at that time, but because, well, this message of salvation was meant for the Jews first. That's who God promised it to, but he also was extending that promise to the whole world. All right, so now Jesus tells them that they shouldn't take anything with them. What does Jesus want to teach them by not allowing them to take anything with them?
To rely on God.
Yeah, it teaches them to rely on God even when it seems like there is nothing. Because remember, they might come to a town that does not accept them, and if they're out of food and that sort of thing, they're just told, don't bother with that town, just leave it. So now they have to trust in God to take care of them as they travel. Now let's read verse 15 again. Truly I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. What does verse 15 suggest about what will happen on Judgment Day to the wicked?
It's not going to be pretty.
It is not going to be pretty. Especially
That's
when
an
we get,
interesting question because Sodom and Gomorrah was completely wiped out. How can you get any worse than being completely wiped out?
yeah.
You don't want to find out, Eric.
Oh, well,
You're probably right.
Right? Okay. Yeah. Todd just said because it's eternal. It's not. Sodom and Gomorrah was wiped out, but then it was done. It was, yeah. It's scary to think about because Eric's right. Like they were completely decimated.
Yeah,
Mhm.
but everybody who was in Sodom and Gomorrah went to hell too then. Or were there still believers in Sodom and Gomorrah? I thought that there weren't.
There weren't any believers in Sodom and
So they all,
Gomorrah.
so they all went to hell. Well, that was eternal as well. So,
Right.
Yep.
But when the question was asked, I was only thinking about the physical, like the
right.
actual place, physical place.
Gotcha.
hmm But as
So
Renee,
I don't understand why it would be worse because they seem equivalent in my mind. Because either way, you're refusing salvation. You're refusing Jesus.
Actually, something just occurred to me, and yes, I'm pushing my glasses up on my nose when I say, well, actually, it occurs to me that it might actually be worse for the town because there's the potential for them to witness their being rejected by God. Sodom and Gomorrah was just wiped out. They were devastated and they were killed. They didn't see others getting the benefit from Christ where these towns might. It's kind of like witnessing somebody else get rewarded and you don't get it. I mean, that probably is a worse feeling.
yeah. Yeah, and that's really what we are seeing here is that there is a worse punishment for those who hear the gospel and reject it. Because we have to remember, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, they didn't hear that Jesus was the Messiah. They would have most likely heard about a coming Messiah, probably long forgotten and rejected because of the sins of their fathers, who rejected that belief, and now it wasn't perpetuated and taught to them. But they had Lot, who would have mentioned all these things about the promises that God had made to Abram, or Abraham as he came to be known. But they wouldn't have heard about Jesus specifically.
But
The
I
people
thought
in
that
these
that's how
towns.
I thought that's how it worked though. For everybody in the Old Testament, they were supposed to believe in the future Messiah, and that's the same as us believing
Yep.
in the Messiah who had come. So if they don't believe in the future Messiah and live accordingly, like, well, I guess the belief is the only thing, then they're turning away.
Yep, and you are completely correct. That is true. The Old Testament and the New Testament, they had the same faith in Jesus, and that is the only way in which they are saved. The point I'm making is that there is a difference in being told in the future this is going to happen and being told it is true right now. It's like the difference between telling someone 100 years ago that they're going to receive a PlayStation 5. They're like, okay, I don't know what that thing is, but I understand that it is a great thing in the future. And then a person in the present, and they're told, hey, I'm going to give you a PlayStation 5. Well, if a group of people was told that and some people rejected saying, I don't believe that to be true, but then they see it actually happening, they're going to feel different. That's kind of what it's going on here. So the people in the Old Testament, they didn't see the Messiah. They were promised a Messiah. And so when they see it, they're like, oh man, we missed out on that. But those people who were told, hey, Jesus is the Messiah, and they said, we don't believe that. When they see that Jesus really is the Messiah on the last day, it's going to be a lot worse for them because they'll have realized they were so close to salvation and then missed it.
Does God give any kind of expectation that the Old Testament individuals should have still believed, because it does say that he
Yes.
put everything in nature to make the proof of his existence, like, to where nobody can deny the fact that God exists. And then of course in Genesis, I mean, they already talk about, they don't say the word Trinity, but you already know that God's in three persons. So how do they reconcile that?
Well, everything about God was also taught to the Jews. We sort of see the Trinity mentioned. Obviously, you mentioned the Genesis account, let us make man in our image.
Exactly.
But we also see that in really a big thing for the Jews is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, our God, the Lord is one. And if you look at it, why does it mention God's name 3 times? The Lord, our God, the Lord. And then it says, he is one. Then we also see it in the Aaronic blessing, which we hear at church pretty much every Sunday. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look on you with favor and give you peace. There's a lot of this threefold repetition, and the Jews, they really do understand that God has this sort of interesting dynamic where he is multiple and yet one. They won't go so far as to call it a trinity, but they will say, hey, that isn't outside of the realm of what we understand and teach. It's just not the way that they would say it. They would reject it entirely, in fact, but they do get this idea that God is this weird, multiple but one being because he is God. And they see that in his name, Elohim, which is the literal plural version of God, but it's a majestic plural in this case. And so the reason it's going to be worse for people who hear the gospel is because they will have known the truth that Jesus is the way to salvation. And for those Jews, they would have seen Jesus face to face, and then to see that as being true, well, that's going to make everything worse for them. It's going to be an eternal punishment for everybody who rejects Christ, but it's going to be terrible for them because they will realize how close they were and still failed. Does that make sense?
Sounds good.
Okay, if there are no other questions about that, we're going to talk about the last thing. This is really going to focus us on the discussion that little James had with Jesus, and also about the actor who plays little James, Jordan Walker Ross. And there's a specific reason that they had this conversation. But first, I want to read just a short passage from 2 Corinthians that I think works well with this section. But he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." So in the episode, or throughout the series, we've seen that little James has to have a walking stick because he has trouble walking. He has an issue. He has a malady that prevents him from walking normally. And that's actually true of the actual actor. What was his name again? Jordan Walker Ross. He has, I believe if I remember, it's cerebral palsy. Is that correct? Does anyone know off the top of their head if that's correct? I know he has um, a disease. I just don't remember which one it is. Yes, he has cerebral palsy and scoliosis and asthma as well. And so that's why little James is portrayed in that way. And then little James finally has a discussion with Jesus, especially as Jesus is sending him out to heal people. And he asks the question, well, then why haven't you healed me? And Jesus says, well, because you being able to preach that message and still rejoice in your suffering, that's going to be a far more powerful message than you telling people how I healed you. Because you will show people how to bear their own crosses, how not everything is going to be solved by Christ, but rather some things are left and we are still to rejoice in them. And I really think that's what Paul is getting at here when he talks about his weakness, his thorn in the flesh, that Jesus refused to remove from him, and he rejoices in it all the more, because in his weakness, Christ is made strong.
Well, and I always like to, because had a friend about that who just asked me, well, why is there still suffering? And I've always kind of pointed out that God's going to, whatever is going to get us to be closer to him and rely on him, he's going to do. And that's kind of what I thought with that one, is like, it's going to bring more people to believe if they can see little James, who still, like you said, can still be happy about and still believe in Jesus in spite of his ailment, and how many more people that's going to bring. So it serves the end goal. The goal isn't to the goal isn't to be healed in this life. The goal is eternity, and God's gonna do whatever it needs to happen to get that goal,
Yep, exactly. It's all to focus us on God and what he has done for us. And Jesus reminds him, saying, hey, you won't be able to walk in this life, but in the next one, you will be doing so much more. And that's what you should really be looking forward to, is that day where I call you faithful one and bring you to be with me forever in heaven. And then there will be no diseases, no death, no anything like that.
Well, and the other thing I've seen is like, it's almost like they blame God for their ailment or life situation rather than blaming sin, whether it's their sin or somebody else's sin. And they, are the collateral damage, for lack of a better word.
Yep.
I think people really respond well in general to other people who have suffered or overcome or are dealing positively with something that is difficult in life. And it's much more powerful to actually witness that or to see that or to know that and then see how somebody responds. And so yeah, this part is I really enjoyed this part, and it's really powerful. But also just makes a lot of sense. And as a teacher, being able to explain some of my worst failures to students in life, my important, most important learning lessons
Mhm.
were always the most powerful examples for them.
Yep. Yep, exactly. It is the making it through the fires that are in our lives and coming out stronger on the other side because of our faith in Christ. Those types of things really inspire a lot of people, and it leads them to ask a lot of questions, saying, you went through all of this suffering, and yet you still rejoice, you still praise God and thank Him for everything. And sometimes they may even hear you thanking God for the suffering that you went through. And that is not anything that is usual in our world. People want to avoid suffering as much as possible. In fact, people have to put trigger warnings for things because they don't want people who have gone through suffering to have to relive those things.
Well, the really cool thing is that they've forgotten that through suffering we learn. When everything is super easy, we don't learn anything and we take it for granted. So the suffering is when that part in the Bible, I don't know where it is, where it talks about praise God through the suffering. It's like, yeah, because I get to learn something, I get to improve myself, I get to rely on Jesus better and all that stuff.
Yep.
The part though in this episode where Matthew's dad and he are reconciling, and you just were saying that, I was thinking of all the suffering, and I think Matthew's mom was like, "Okay, yeah, look, he chose you," and Matthew's like, "Oh my gosh, I know, and he chose me, and I'm doing this," and his dad is like, "Oh, you have a chance to save our family name or make it better now." It's like sometimes we still, I mean, there's those of us who still see it. It's right in front of their face. He reconciled with the son. And that was just like so human because I know this is all, made up, right? This is,
Mhm.
but it very much underscored the fact that, oh yes, these people were still human.
Yep. And that's actually something that we still see even in the Bible itself, talking about a lot of the things like we see later on. It doesn't hide the fact that Peter denied Jesus 3 times. That is made perfectly clear. It always shows the failings of the leaders of the church, which is an unusual thing for religions. And that's one thing that we can point to show, hey, Christianity is a little more reliable and trustworthy than a lot of these others because they always paint their religious leaders in a higher light. The church is known, or the Bible is known for putting down every single one of the people in the Bible. All the human beings that are in the Bible, they always mess up somewhere. Abraham messed up, Isaac messed up, Jacob messed up, his sons messed up. It just keeps going on. There's never a single person mentioned in the Bible who was just, oh yeah, you were perfect your whole life. There may have been exceptions with Enoch, but we don't hear much about Enoch. All we hear is that he walked in the way of God and he didn't let him die. We don't know why, we don't know what that is, but he followed God and, well, God took him home in a
Well, and
different
just
way.
like what Todd said, when you see that a person has suffered in a lot of the same way you have, you feel heard, you feel understood, you feel like, oh, there's actually a way that I can overcome this. What did you do? Let me copy what you did. And
Yep.
then, like, even with the disciples, when we see that they screwed up, it's like, okay, good. That means my one screw up isn't going to nullify everything and send me to hell, So it's like, as long as you repent and everything. So you can, if something is too perfect, you can't identify with it.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And And we see again and again that there's nothing really, there's no sin that can exclude us ultimately from Christ's love, except obviously if we continually reject Christ. But if we are seeking Christ and are worried that our sin might exclude us, the Bible makes it very clear that there isn't a single person who is excluded. Because if we look at every person whom the Bible holds up on a pedestal, such as Moses, and a lot of other people, we see there's basically nothing that is a sin that kept them from being chosen by God. I mean, Moses murdered someone. We see technically Judah technically committed a sort of incest because he ended up with his daughter-in-law as a wife.
Let's not forget about King David.
Yep, and King David. Oh, it is from the house of David that Christ came from. Well, that is from a man's wife, and the man he murdered and tried to do all these things in order to hide the fact that he had sex with that man's wife. And for all we know from the context, it could have been a very much rapey type of sex, because we don't know how Bathsheba actually reacted when she was brought to David's house. But there's a whole lot of issues with David just in that one account that can lead to a whole lot of problems. And yet, David was promised, hey, you are going to be the line that the Savior is going to come from. And David was called the man after God's own heart. There is no one who is excluded. There is no sin that can exclude you from God and his love for us. And that's just an amazing thing. And that's really what we see also happening here. It's not that God doesn't love Jordan here. It's not that God didn't love little James. If that is the case, you don't have anything to say otherwise. But in this account, in this telling of it, it doesn't mean that God didn't love him. It means that God trusts them to handle these sufferings and to trust that they will turn to him when they're struggling. And that's really what God does with suffering. Is he says, you can handle this. This is something that you can handle. And I'm giving it to you because I know in the end, you're going to turn to me when you can't.
When you were mentioning all the people, what was Job's sin?
Job?
Yeah.
The reason for his suffering is not a result of any sin that he commits. But he does question God.
I thought you
And
could
he probably had numerous sins just like the rest of us,
Yeah.
just that they didn't write a whole book about it because it would have taken way longer.
Yep.
Oh, well, when they describe Job, they say they don't mention any of that stuff. But I didn't know how much questioning God was a sin, other than like to try to understand, versus outright saying, God, you shouldn't be doing this. I don't think he ever said that, did he?
He does.
Oh, he does. Okay.
He calls out
But
God.
being righteous, I mean, I hope that. Go ahead, Eric.
No, that's me. You go.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say being righteous doesn't mean that we're sinless either, right? I mean, I hope that at my
Correct.
funeral, people aren't like, oh, Carrie did this and this and this and this, because that's like 1 hour in the life of Carrie. But, you know, I hope people remember me for my faith rather than all my failures.
Yep.
Okay, then it was my fault for just reading it wrong, because I know that they describe him as a pious and upright man, and I just assumed that meant that he was without, I think they even said that, without blame or without.
Yeah, they do call him a man who is, if you reread Job chapter 1,
pious and upright and without, not without sin, but without blame or something like that, I thought. maybe.
There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil.
Right.
Then I think, let's see, in chapter 2, God says the same things again and adds, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. So we do see that it's not that he is considered blameless and upright, but we also are considered blameless now because, yeah, just as is written by the Smoldens, righteousness is equal to forgiveness. Because he feared God, he was repentant and forgiven. But I'm trying to find where
Oh, I
we.
see. I was equating righteousness with like perfection. So, or like,
Well, it is, and we are considered righteous in the sight of God, yet we are still sinners. It's this sinner saint sort of
Right.
thing.
I guess I would never describe myself as righteous though. So I don't know.
That's and
I-
that's and
me,
and
yeah.
that's where I would say you need to keep in mind the phrase that Martin Luther used. He used the Latin phrase simul justus et peccator, which is at the same time saint and sinner, indicating that we are righteous in the sight of God, because that's how he talks about us, that we are now righteous because of what Christ has done, but we are still at the same time sinners. We are both at the same time. Yeah, I can't find specifically where we start seeing Job starting to question God, but God makes it clear that Job is questioning him when he says, "Who is this that
Yeah, who am
obscures my
I? Yeah.
plans with words without knowledge?"
It's pretty much saying, who do you think you are? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what we see Job really is doing is his friends that come along are trying to find out what sin he committed to cause all this bad stuff to happen, which we see in chapters 1 and 2 was nothing. There was no sin he had committed that caused it. It was simply God saying, "Look, I'm going to show you how loyal Job is to me." And Job ultimately shows his loyalty to God, even when he starts asking God the question, "Hey, God, can you explain yourself to me? I don't get it. I don't understand what's going on. Can you explain to me why these things happen to me?" And God's honest answer is, "Who are you to ask me for a reason? Do I really need one? No, I don't. Look at what all the stuff I have done. Where were you when I did those things? You weren't there. You weren't even a thought yet. I was the only one who was there. I made all these decisions. I can cause you to suffer simply because I simply allow it to happen to you."
So then the parts when we were talking about, why does God allow suffering? Because obviously he does allow it when Satan is tempting Job. So he does allow it, but a lot of times I always think the suffering is because of the mistakes that we've made or the sins that we've made. Not as like you made a mistake, so now I'm
Cause and
gonna
effect.
hit you with something, but it's more of when you don't choose the right path, then obviously you're gonna have negative side effects, right? So
Yep. But is that always true?
so then would surely they're not right when they say though that God will give you, well, yeah, I said that earlier. God will give you whatever he needs to get you to heaven. So but I
Yeah.
just don't think of God saying, "Hey, I'm going to give this kid cancer." So I don't usually think of that.
Yeah, no, we never think about God giving us these terrible things in order to get us to heaven. But does he do that? Yes, absolutely, because what are we to do? We are to turn to him. We are to put our trust in him.
Right.
This is part of what we see when Paul talks about how God won't give us anything more than we can handle. He won't allow us to be tempted beyond what we can bear. What are we tempted to do when there's suffering? To turn away from God. God, though, always will provide us a way out from temptation. And that may be just us turning to him in prayer and strengthening our faith to get through those fires of sufferings that are tempting us as we are suffering, or it could be to completely remove the suffering so that we are no longer tempted in that way. God can do whatever he wants, and ultimately his goal is to get us to heaven. And that's really what that other passage from Romans that says, God works all things for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. A lot of people misuse that passage and trying to understand it as God is only going to allow good things to happen to me. Anything bad that happens, well, it's going to ultimately work out for something good. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you keep suffering and you keep suffering and you keep suffering because that good he's referring to is the fact you remained faithful despite suffering, and now you receive eternal life in heaven. All right. Yep. Hopefully we'll be able to see that. I'm hoping we'll be able to get the season 4 here at the theaters, and we'll be able to watch that as a group, hopefully. But yeah,
I looked it up online while we were waiting to start, and it does show that they have, it's like almost 3 hours and 45 minutes on Thursday, the 1st of February.
awesome. That sounds
Yep.
awesome.
So I think that'll be the first 4 episodes. So I'm excited.
I think that's right. Yep.
Well, thank you, Pastor. I appreciate it.
Yep, no problem. Okay, and that is all that I have, unless anyone has any other comments or questions to make about what we just talked about. If not, have a great rest of your week, and I will see you all on Sunday.
You too, Pastor.
Thank you.